Know that they ride or die. I keep boys by my side. Know that they ride or die. I keep boys by my side. Day we hustle, but the night we know that they ride or die. I'm a OG boy. Know that they ride or die. I keep boys by my side. Know that they ride or die. I keep boys by my side. Day we hustle, but the night we boys by my side. Know that they ride or die. My name came up a lot, it sounds more when I was not a sort of the notion or the phenomena of hypersexuality within a society, it typically is a consequence of things, but it's also obvious, like obviously it's also the cause of some things, and is usually like related to decadence in a society. So like from a historical standpoint, for example, we always use Rome, like the state of Rome, as sort of the poster child for many things we want to talk about in terms of the rise and fall of societies. Definitely is not just Rome, obviously, but when you look at sort of the fall of Rome, one of the telltale signs is when they become like sort of obsessed with sex, and not just sex in a biological sense, because obviously you have sex in a biological sense where a male and female can, you know, fertilize and reproduce life, which is technically the definition of sex when you say sex, sexual reproduction. But the hypersexualization, not just in the sense of having more sex per se, or even being obsessed with sex itself, but like sort of the consequences of fixating on that sort of stimulus, so that people wind up targeting and sexualizing objects that are outside of the realm of sexual reproduction. So like in Rome, you know, they fell off deep into, you know, they had the whole public orgies, they were into pedophilia, they were into, you know, men were owning small male children and all these sorts of weird paganistic sort of mixes of their culture with their religion, but it was also hypersexualized. And there was a spike in that at the dusking of Rome. So like as the society was on the decline and the moral fabric of the society was on the decline, they were getting invaded culturally, economically, and you know, sort of when they started to lose also their physical, their military prowess. It seems like in those gasps of desperation, sort of the society turns into this sort of lustful space where, you know, they sexualize things and attempt to I'm not sure if it would be a type of a satisfaction, of a pacification, of just a diversion. But it certainly, like in the case of Rome, it seemed to represent a disconnect from morality, from reality, and from the healthy society. And it is sort of one of the signs of a downfall of society. And it's almost like it's when the people don't have anything to sort of occupy or entertain a higher level of reasoning and morality. So they sort of want to watch sex, and they want to sort of just seek out these physical gratifications. And sex, you know, sexualization of the world is like the epitome of that. You know, it goes hand in hand with, you know, drugs or just any sorts of types of binging, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no,
Uh,
that makes sense. Yep. And I was thinking, basically something similar along those lines of just the different characteristics, like you was mentioning, of just kind of being fixated on sex, not necessarily an increase in like sexual activity, but just the hyperalization of it in general, just the focus on it. And I do think that there are certain characteristics and definitely consequences of societies that display that, like you mentioned and talked about Rome, and you see some of the things take places in other societies that are hypersexualized. And I think it does become when you overindulge in something, I think it does trigger pleasure seeking behavior. So you take things kind of out of the natural context and it just becomes you're more pleasure seeking because you live in this hypersexualized society that's basically trying to tap into something that's naturally something good, but when it's manipulated, it can cause bad behaviors, like with drug addiction. It's a pleasure seeking thing for the brain. It wants that reaction to happen over and over again because it's a good reaction. And I also think that you'll see in those type of societies, people become more emotionally raw, and I would say kind of like bipolar, where once they disassociate from the natural emotions that come with sex itself, and they just do it for pleasure seeking purposes and not necessarily for the best of their health or the environment or anything like that. In order to do that, you have to disconnect in some kind of way. So when people watch movies and all they do, they have a sex scene in every movie, and they dramatize it and they make it like it's the best thing. Then of course most people are gonna naturally want to experience that. So then it gives you this for some people an unrealistic idea of what sex even is. So now somebody is putting into your head what sex should be versus you already kind of knowing naturally the purpose of sex. And
Right.
you see that in these societies, and people become generally unable to even think or meditate deeply because they're so pleasure seeking, and they just want things to be more shallow because they just want to tap into the physical idea of sex. And it's like, oh, they want somebody who's good looking, or they want somebody who has a lot of money, and they're associating all these things with sex, and they're taking away the components or the complexity of what sex was even designed for. So you see people they're more eager to move forward and move on, because once they don't have that pleasure that they're seeking, they're going to go on to the next thing that's going to re-stimulate them, um, to give them that hypersexualized behavior. And you see low morale, people become more numb. And I also think people start to distort the sexual urge and like misinterpret it. So they distort the interpretation of sex itself. And I think that's when you see more things like pornographic material. People use sex for inappropriate purposes, like you said, the orgies and stuff. You start seeing a rise in that because all of this is basically showing you that these people are seeking a certain type of pleasure, and they're kind of abusing it. Almost, if you see a person with like an eating disorder, it's pretty much the same thing. Like, you eat this thing, you become addicted to it, and now you just kind of, it's other things that go with that. But in general, when things become hyperalized, you see the activity happen more and more, and then you become numb because it's almost like you grow a tolerance for it because you're abusing it, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I agree, man. Couple things you said. So let's see. I'll just read off sort of these sort of thoughts I had while you were speaking, and then I'll just, if you don't mind, just sort of go back and just touch on each
Yeah,
one
for
just
sure.
briefly.
Yep.
But psychologically, what happens with an individual with sort of a sexual um, sort of a disposition to hypersexuality expression, using it as a form of self-expression and expression, the same way one might use any normal means of communication. Uh, Sex as a drug, or at least having sort of the same sort of effects and tendencies that a drug will have on a person. Sex violence as a consequence of not being able to achieve satisfaction, which would be sort of a consequence of an expressed frustration per se. And sort of the ways of trying to satisfy an increasingly demanding endorphin rush. Sex as a food, sex attached to self-image and esteem. So, really quickly, when you said pornography, it's interesting because that can be sort of a model or a case study, sort of what happens to individuals in reality. And I remember seeing a documentary on that at one time, and it talked about how what happens is when a person, so in the past, when people were aroused with each other, males and females would become aroused, and they would sort of take that further, and it would end up in an act of actual reproduction, or at least an act that was capable of sexual reproduction. The advent of pornography seemed to go in sort of lockstep with the sort of the changing of that perception of what actually sex meant, and when it was starting to get away from an act of reproduction that coincided with physical stimulus to something in and of itself that did not necessarily have to be tied to the potential of reproduction. And so pornography, the advent of pornography, sort of a person would get in front of a magazine or a picture or something, and obviously as technology progressed, they get in front of moving images and clearer and sharper images. Well, what winds up happening physiologically is a physiological response is triggered in response to virtual imagery. And so there's a set of endorphins and hormones that get going off of that stimulus, except it's not a real female there, or it's not a male there. In the case of a woman, it's an image. It's actually, glass and plastic and, some zeros and ones or whatever that are representing something that in the mind of the observer, right, triggers the same sort of physiological response as if there would be a proper outlet for that, or at least a sexual partner. And when there's not, sort of the rise in endorphins, it is sort of like a drug in a sense that it gives a person a high, and it gives a person a one-sided satisfaction in the sense that the person feels a physiological satisfaction, except there's no actual shared experience. So this is a person and a computer. So typically, what winds up happening as a result of that is the person may feel physiologically satiated, but they don't feel psychologically satisfied or accepted, as it were, because there's no real relationship. And when the person returns to satisfy sort of the previous levels of longing, they wind up looking at more images and visuals, except for now, like in the case of a drug, the stakes are higher. It's going to take more stimulation to reach sort of the same physiological level of endorphins um, and the perceived satisfaction as it does the previous times, because the tolerance is elevated. And it's particularly elevated quicker in the case of pornography because the person has sort of this wide range of variety at their disposal immediately, right? They're not going to a club, flashing money, working on their best line, trying to get accepted from a real female, They are instantly being able to browse, hundreds or thousands, endless numbers of attractive women without any sort of risk of rejection at all. So everything that will be organically tied to a sexual pursuit is missing, and sort of the level of endorphins, the physiological response, there's more required at every stage to achieve this. And so my point was that so yeah, they but the person socially can become more detached because they're not achieving sort of the acceptance. Sometimes that same person, they don't have to work to go out and speak with another human being in reality where they would, risk rejection or acceptance. It turns into sort of this one-sided fulfillment. And
Mm.
it's a detriment to real human organic intimacy and relationships. And it also sort of raises the bar And last thing I would say on that one real quick is that um, a lot, and it leads to sort of sexual burnout for a lot of people.
Right.
So a lot of men are unable, they find themselves unable to be physically stimulated by real world partners and women because, right, they've sort of burned themselves out like sort of a person that's drank so much or smoked so much that, there's not, it takes so much for them to get high now that they hardly get anything out of it. They don't get that same rush. And there's a lot of case studies that back that up and show that. So yeah, that's interesting, man. That
Yeah,
would be one of the effects of sexuality in a society.
definitely. And I think that does tie into a lot of what we both were saying. I think kind of on the same page as far as what you kind of will see from a society who's hypersexualized. You do see, a lot of distorted interpretations again, like I said, and then using sex for unintended purposes, like what you said. You somebody using a computer or they searching pornographic materials, which is leading to now another problem, like you said, the social component. Even though it was pretty much introduced to you through the same platforms, like society kind of introduces this idea um, to get society in a hypersexualized state, and then it kind of leads to other things that actually makes you less social or less functional um, physically as a human being. So
Right, and we see a lot of violence. The advent of increased violence and rape, even when the violence doesn't appear to be of a sexual nature, it can be tied to sort of this frustration that individuals feel in terms of, so it's sort of like if a person in a hypersexualized society where everything is sexualized, the individual is tempted to sort of process things in a sexual way. And not just, I mean, the sexualized car commercials or every, almost
right,
every commercial you see,
yeah,
they sort
everything,
of can have a way to blatantly or suggestively sexualize it. But if the person is, so if a male ties sort of his self worth and his virility to sexual prowess in a way, then what winds up happening is that person is constantly challenging themselves to sort of prove that and sort of live up to a certain standard. So any sort of inability to perform sexually can be a reflection of a person's perceived manhood and worthiness,
hmm,
or even the rejection of a sexual advance can be seen as a rejection of the person themselves and
right,
not just the turning down of the act.
right,
In terms of like if a woman, right, is not hungry and you want to give her something to eat but she's not hungry and she says no thank you right now,
right,
right, that wouldn't be, a person wouldn't take that sort of as a rejection per se. If she says I'm not hungry right now, we're watching a movie and she doesn't want to eat, that's fine.
right,
But sometimes when it comes to an act of sex, if that person rejects and then rejects that action or that course, that part of being in a hypersexualized society where one's very identity is tied to sex and sexuality, then what happens is that the rejection of the act can be contrived as a rejection of the very person. And sometimes a frustration like a person will feel, like even if a person is weaning themselves off of drugs, or if they can't get their hands on some drugs, or this thing that they're addicted to, the levels of frustration that come out of that and sort of the misdirection of that energy and those hormones and sort of the emotions that are tied to it can lead to violence and frustration. sometimes in an obvious sexual way, and sometimes in a way that's not, so obviously sexual. So
Yeah,
that,
definitely.
that was so that sex is a violence.
Yeah. And I think that it's definitely a link between the two. Because you're gonna have to display, basically you're trying to express this repressed or in this case I would say probably not even repressed, but you're trying to express this behavior, or you're trying to communicate something that you don't fully understand. And I think a lot of times human beings resort to violence when they don't know how to express themselves in any way. And I think that it's not that can be applied even with hypersexualized behavior, in my opinion. So but I see that with a lot of things is that when humans are not able to articulate themselves in certain societies, you see that they always resort to violence as a means of basically trying to be heard. And or if they don't fully understand themselves, they resort to violence. And I think that's why you will see a lot of things like road rage. People just kind of take like, oh, the person was angry about the traffic. But I think if you dig deeper, you'll find out that there's always more to those stories. Even mass killings, like we know that all of those things are tied in together somehow. We don't always know what the link is. But in my opinion, I think that it is all kind of tied in together, even though a person can easily argue and say, well, being hypersexualized have nothing to do with mass killing. Of course, there's room for argument there, but I think that there's also room to support it if you just kind of did the research, which I haven't done. But it's still kind of my opinion on it. Is that's why you see more and more violence at certain times. Because even when society, let's take America for example, at one point I feel that America was a hyposexualized society where they kind of didn't want to talk about sex, and sex was like a no thing to address. And you still seen certain type of behaviors that correlated with them in that time, where people became basically sexually sick due to the repression, the repressed sexuality. They wasn't able to express themselves sexually, especially the women. But also the men in a lot of ways weren't able to really talk about sex because that wasn't the thing to do or whatever. And people become more sneaky. Or if you look at like nuns or priests or certain people who have like these sub societies, like these cults and things like that of that nature, when they tell you to take sex out of your everyday life because it's a sin or something like that, you start seeing sneaky behaviors where people go into the closet, so to speak, and do things that are unhealthy because now they're unable to express their sexuality. And that's where you get an increase in lust because it's something that's natural, something that you should be doing, and now you become more lustful because you're not able to talk about it. And when you have a woman in that type of position, people will just say, "Oh, she's fast, or she's provocative," and it's like, well, something is leading to that. Versus a male, um, I don't think people will put a negative term to it, but they usually revert to unhealthy behaviors as well, which you see an increase in molestation or something like of that nature. Or you see people, they kind of become these transgender, like kind of how they say, because they're uncertain because they're not able to find out. I wouldn't say how they're unable to find out, but they're unable to express their sexuality. So I think that leads to confusion in a way, because now since you don't know, you'll try anything to kind of get this energy off because something is there and something is driving you to do something, but you're unable to do it. And you see the increase in, like I said, molestation, the homosexuality, and rape. And I think that is also a part of our society today, which is why it's this kind of violent mix where you don't know if it's due to hypersexualization or hyposexualization, because you kind of see it all mixed up together. But I think if you really paid attention, you'll see that being a religious based society, there was definitely a large gap where sex was not popular in media. Even before media itself was popular, there was no way to really advertise sex, and people definitely didn't talk about sex in the homes when it was religious based. And you saw the intertwining of those two types of societies come together once they implemented the media and they were able to put information in people's homes. You've seen a clash between those two. So you've seen a clash between a religious home, and then they introduce media, and now they're telling their kids what to watch and what not to watch, because they're like, that's bad, but not necessarily finger pointing to themselves saying that what they're doing is bad as well. Because if you don't teach kids about sex in a healthy way, you can't really fault them for falling victim to being basically fed lies or distorted views on sex.
Okay. Yeah, man. I think that sort of like in the same way, like in some of our in one of our other episodes, at least we talked about the differences between dominant culture and what it seems and what it's like to be sort of a subculture that's exists within exists under the umbrella and mandates of a more dominant culture. I think sometimes the challenge for us is to decipher what are our native, our own genuine organic reactions to societal pressures and perversions as Black people. What is um, what is genuinely ours per se versus what is sort of what we're also partaking of, because it's the dominant culture that typically sets the trends, at least in terms of mass media and the sort of programming that we're all subjected to. They sort of set the trends and the models of what is acceptable, what is not acceptable behavior, based on whatever agendas or mindsets that they may have. They sort of set that stage for us, and we are sort of subjected to it. And oftentimes, I think what you see in our community is that there's an initial wave of rejection or resistance, and then that dwindles down to sort of factions and spaces of resistance where we still talk and try and look intelligently and at things and cipher through that information. But you'll see sort of a popular movement that sort of gets with it and goes with the flow. And we may wind up, sadly, generations down, we look at things and we think, that, Black folks, quote unquote, are doing this too. Often what you're seeing is the rearing of our children with under the auspices of a hyper-sexualized society, or at least of a more dominant culture. So sometimes it's hard to figure out what is us, what came from us, and what's a genuine reaction that we're having versus what we're being fed in the media. So yeah, that's just to speak to sort of a couple of points you made. I
Yeah.
wanted to say, like, sex is food, for example. Sex
Mm.
is food. And I love my metaphors and allegories. So
Right, right. You got to throw
food,
one in there.
when you look at organic health food, and say you take a leaf of spinach, for example, and there's all these ingredients in there, and so you have protein in there, you have vitamin A and E, and you have fiber, and all these things exist together, and in a sort of mutually complementary way, like a synergistic way, where the protein is bound to the fiber, is bound to these nutrients and acids. And when you consume it, it's sort of like the fabric of a thing that holds it together. And then it's sort of like a puzzle. It can be taken apart, and then the pieces can then be used and directed as they're supposed to in a healthy way, because it's all there together. But as opposed to, for example, a laboratory taking the same spinach, extracting the vitamin, A, saying that you can get fiber from that pill over there. They got vitamin A in a pill over here, right? And then what winds up happening is you have this huge absorption problem in the human body, because you're only going to get, maybe a 3% absorption rate, whereas 97% of that stuff is going to go right through the body. You can get higher absorption rates based on what those companies claim their complex, you know, vitamin structures are and the science behind it, that you're going to get this great absorption rate. But that always pales in comparison to the absorption rates that you get in real organic food. And that's because those things exist together. They're bound, they're part of the same package. And when you try and strip some of those ingredients from the wholesome food, what you wind up with is something that's less quality and arguably is harmful, right? Because if you're just taking protein pills, or you're taking certain hormones and they're not balanced in the product, what winds up happening is, you can overindulge in that stuff. You have side effects and the like, whereas it's best to just consume the thing organically and wholesomely.
Right.
What does that have to do with it? Well, sex, when we look at sort of the quintessential moral model of sex, where they'd say, okay, a man and a woman, they meet, they get to know each other, there's sort of an intellectual stimulation there, they're talking, they get to know each other as persons and human beings. Whereas there could be parts of her character that the man respects, that interests him before any of the physical intimacy, and vice versa. This woman can find out, hey, is this a type of guy who, respects um, women and values and himself, etc. What'll be the consequences if I share, right, my intimate space with this person? Sort of this whole courtship phase, this getting to know phase, would be like part of an organic ingredient. Whereas once you do all this prepping and you have this sort of a recipe, and then you get ready to make the goods, there's a whole package there. Nobody would argue that you just throw, a cake or something in there without the proper ingredients and hope it turns out right.
Right.
But it seems in a hyper-sexualized society, people constantly just sort of mix up the mass, throw them in the oven, see what pops out. Maybe it'll turn out right this time. And typically, what happens with that is a constant, persistent uh, betrayal of one's self by oneself, and also a betrayal and a perceived betrayal on behalf of that partner.
Mm-hmm.
Because just like trying to consume part of a food without the other ingredients, what happens when sex is sort of thinned down and boiled down to just a physical act, people are in denial. Why? Because there are ties and intimate connections that are being made there. Whether a person is conscientiously thinking, okay, I want hugs and kisses and affection, which
Right.
is a telltale sign of what they're truly looking for.
Mm-hmm.
But even all that aside, it is not realistic for men or women. And I would argue sometimes the consequences are more stark and severe for women when you have multiple partners. And this isn't to be chauvinistic, I'm just speaking physiologically.
Right.
Multiple partners, and what happens when these connections, all these connections are made and then broken, and constantly broken, and there's this constant letdown. Either the persons are aware of this, or it's just happening sort of on a subconscious level. but inevitably people find themselves thinking about that person. There are shadows of various people that sort of follow them around, and then sort of in vulnerable moments, they feel like reaching out. Those are all connections. And it's sort of like the consequence of trying to consume the raw thing without it being bound uh, with the cohesiveness of the other ingredients that are part of it, that are rightly part of it. So, nowadays we see people with relation you see people with relationships, right, with their cars, or they want to marry their
Right.
dogs and all this sort of stuff. And it's this rampant sort of misdirection of
Mm-hmm.
the energy of the
Or
looking
even their
at
kids
things
a
through
lot of times.
sexualized eyes.
Yep.
Well, yeah, I mean anything out of, and I'm just going to the most extreme example so that people can sort of look for few far and in between that. It's
Yep.
sort of an anything goes sort of thing. It's a consequence of looking at things through sexualized eyes and visions. And they say once a person becomes, if a person becomes too much like a hammer, everything looks like a nail. you know,
Yep. Yep. Definitely. And I think that's the thing. It's like toxicity versus deficiency. Like that's really what you're kind of dealing with when you say like you overindulge even in sex is I think those principles still apply. Like um if you eat too much of anything, whether it be vitamin A, potassium, or consuming alcohol, too much of it is going to create a toxicity, which is going to have a negative impact on your body. And the same thing with deficiencies, they're usually bad. So the body is always looking for balance. Like balance is really the goal, where you partake in things in a healthy mannerism, basically. And I don't think sex is excluded from that.
of
And
course not.
yeah, in our societies I think that has always kind of been a battle, because you will have, especially when people ask the question like why, and they'll say why are, they'll pinpoint or look at somebody like Cardi B or Megan Thee Stallion, and they'll say why is this so popular. Now it's one thing to ask why would somebody do it, but you also have to ask why is there a market for it, right? Because if it really wasn't a market for it, if they couldn't sell it, if it wasn't working, they wouldn't do it, because they're trying to drive something. So you have to say, why is there a market for it? And I think it starts with people
Facts.
being, they're repressed. So you see, like a lot of women are into Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion, and you got to listen to what they're saying. So a lot of times when with younger girls, because it starts at an early age, they're not able to really express themselves sexually in a healthy way, because people are eager to bash them and say, oh, if a preteen is kind of into boys, and she's thinking boys is cute, you'll have people kind of saying don't be fast, or you don't need to be thinking about boys. And I know they're doing it with the right intentions, but it's like you have to be able to explain that in a healthy way, not deprive them of being able to express it. You just have to direct them to say, okay, here are the consequences. I understand you might be liking boys now. There's nothing wrong with that, but you want to be able to create a balance. But when you just say, no, don't think about boys, you can't get your number out, you can't date till you're 21. And I understand people, it's funny, or some people actually believe it. But then once they get on their own, that's the market. That's what's creating the market, because now they see these women who have no problem in their minds. They're thinking these women have no problem expressing their sexuality, not knowing that they're also getting a dose of basically a huge dose of fiction, because they're not telling the truth about it. They're glamorizing it like, oh yeah, be a stripper and make all this money, but they're not talking about how a lot of those women get sexually assaulted and all the things that come with it. But still, that's where you're creating the market. You're creating the market
Right.
at an early age, because they don't have a healthy way to interpret what's really going on. And they've never seen women act like that. So now you have grown women who really, um, they should know better, but they'll still look at Cardi B and them almost as idols. and they'll be like, man, I wish I could be like that deep down inside. But at the same time, because of how they grew up, they might not necessarily be bold enough to take certain action. And I think we have to
Well,
start reanalyzing that.
yeah, facts, man. I agree. And I was just gonna stress that point about what you said, as far as I think the media and I think the advertisement industry plays a huge role in how our children form themselves because and form their opinions of themselves and who they are. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, like they're fed a constant diet of Cardi B and WAP and all this sort of debauchery, and then all of a sudden they think it's okay because of the sheer pervasiveness of it, and that these adults are playing it, and it's
Mm-hmm.
everywhere, so it's taken for granted that it's normalized. So I think they ingest it. It sort of goes into a way of forming what they think their sexuality is and what it's okay to be and what who
Right.
they should be, and then they sort of come up on that, and obviously they're going to become consumers and perpetrators of it.
Mm-hmm.
So then all of a sudden you see these record executives, these filthy sort of executives, that push, that are behind these industries, everything from music to the hijacking of the rap industry to pornography. And they're saying, well, we're just supplying a product that people want from the masses, right? Masses. People are buying this, and that's why we're here. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't think anybody in their right mind will go to a child and say, well, they want candy all day. So, why are you looking at me? I'm just giving them what they're asking for,
Right.
right? They want candy all day. But, at the end of the day, their teeth are going to rot and then fall out,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not healthy, obviously. So, I just wanted to.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. That's kind of the point of the conversation, is to basically pinpoint all of the things that contribute to it. All the contributing factors make a difference.
One quick thing I wanted to say, bro. I'm gonna let you take it home, but about the pornography thing. One of the things I wanted to mention, and I guess it was sort of in the vein of that same documentary, and it is more of a beware sort of thing. So, and just as a quick example, it's sort of like when you go and you have a conversation with an individual, you talk to that individual, the individual speaks back, and what winds up happening is there's an exchange, and you can filter what a person is saying to you. Right, all the people that are listening now, they can hear what I'm saying, they can filter, they can make decisions in real time about whether they agree or disagree, what they want to commit to memory, and what they want to sort of, it's the gatekeeping up front that dictates what goes into your being, what gets committed to memory, what gets committed to dedication, and in a lot of ways to the subconscious. Well, when you're looking at some of these outlets, no matter whatever movie it is, right? I just watched the Godzilla versus King Kong movie,
Oh yeah, I seen it.
the newest one. And one of the things I like to do when I do get I get entertainment value out of it, but I'm always looking at sort of the symphony of messages that are bombarding through the screens and the sounds and
Right.
all the stimulus and the visual. So all sort of the messages and the way they cut from one scene to the next, what they choose to show you at screen 100 mark versus at 101 mark, right? They may cut from King Kong roaring, and the very next scene is, it's the black dude yelling in the hallway, and then they sort of taper it off with a joke like, "Yeah, why'd you scream?" But what's happening sometimes is the writers and the producers, they're crafting sort of messages
Mm-hmm.
that are deeper than the language that you're listening to, the coding, the sounds and the language. There's a layer of communication that's happening there where this is the characters' bodies, how they choose to sequence the scenes, etc.
Right.
So anytime a person subjects themselves to sort of an information source that's going to be multiple, that's going to have many fronts at once, understand that you run the risk of being bombarded with messaging. And the problem with being bombarded with messaging is that a lot of subliminal stuff can get sort of Trojan horse through there. Whereas you're watching one thing and certain visuals and aspects and peripheral visions that flash make it into the mind and the psyche. They get recorded there, and they can wind up altering or influencing a person's self-perception,
Right.
and even sort of a person's instincts. See, a person, if they eat junk food for too much, they start to develop a certain taste, and that's because of the additives that are in that food, or that so-called food. The additives that are in there, they cause the taste buds to be altered so that the person starts to crave that thing where they didn't make a conscious decision to crave such a thing.
Mm-hmm.
This is also one of the dangers and perils of not just pornography, but I would say media in general, because the producers behind this stuff, they're really savvy. It's not just that they say, we just want to entertain a person with a movie about a giant lizard and a monkey, right? Like with Planet of the Apes, we're gonna make correlations and allegories about black people with these monkeys, with these apes. And we'll use it as a trope, and we'll put sort of messaging in there so that we can persuade people and not come and say it right out.
Right.
And I think it's disingenuous to think that that sort of doesn't extend into the porn industry. So people
Mm-hmm.
have to be careful when dealing with those things.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. There's no way around it, and put myself out there, but whatever. Even when looking up
Don't do it,
porn,
bro.
nah, I would notice myself, like, if you type in certain things, you don't necessarily get the results you want. So it's like, if you type in anything, like if you're into black women, what I've noticed, and this is with anything, even if it's not pornographic, if you type in black women, you get a list of white women. Like, white women are gonna pop up. It's gonna be, and it's like, wait. I could have swore I typed in, black women. Whether it's, like I said,
Then you get
porn
a
or not.
white woman in black pants.
Yeah, or something like that. Or you just kind of get like biracial stuff where it won't be black necessarily. But then you don't see, I don't see that with anything else. Like if I Google white women, you won't see Asian women pop up. You won't see. So it's definitely something there to let you know that even that is suggesting to people to say, hey, like, it's okay to kind of substitute the two. You know what I mean? And that's something that I learned at a young age. And that's what kind of drove me away from porn, is once I start picking up on those type of things, and like everything that we were talking about made sense, because I'm like, you know what? I was learning this stuff at an early age because, like I said, um, a lot of this stuff is introduced to us at an early age, and we don't really have no guidance on it because everybody's afraid to talk about it. So you kind of have to learn on your own, and it impacts your relationship directly. It was a direct impact to the relationships where people, have fallen out of healthy relationships because of pornographic material, and that's male and female, because once you create these type of algorithms that are subjective to other people's opinions of what they think you want to see or what you should see, or they want to drive you to think a certain way, you have to be wary of that, and you pretty much have to cut it out, because, like I said, when my diet, like we're talking about sexual diet, and physical diet in all kind of ways. Like I cut out a lot of things that was unhealthy. It wasn't just food. I didn't just like start eating healthy and then cut out other things that was damaging to my body. And that's this topic speaks to that. So I think, like I said, I'm gonna put myself out there because it's all controversial, but at the same time it's not something that I'm ashamed to talk about because it's not really something that was distorted. Like I didn't go to a level where I compromise myself or morale. But again, it basically speaks to exactly what you said. And I think that people do need to be aware of that. Like these things do have consequences.
Yeah, they do. And like you said, you can't sort of if you're talking about eating healthy all week and then a person having a cheat day on Friday, where it's just remember, in the sense of allegories and metaphors, they serve as a purpose to illustrate sort of a higher concept where we may not have language around that to explain it precisely. So the allegory and the metaphor helps. Obviously, um, you don't want to eat healthy and then say, oh, I'm only going to eat poison on Friday, because that's a whole different thing. It's a
Right.
much deadlier consequence. But the food metaphor that we're using, it serves a purpose, and to the extent that it does. When you're talking about something so damaging as pornography, and something where the stakes are much higher if an addiction does occur, sort of like it would be like, you don't want to have a cheat day with meth. You don't want to say, oh, I'm drug free all week, I only have a cheat day with opioids on Friday. That
Right.
don't work. So you gotta, the people have to take things in the proper context. And yeah, man, I believe that also, like you said, there's oftentimes our children, it can be either that we as adults are not comfortable or don't understand about the proper way to speak to children about that.
Hmm.
And then oftentimes, in the case when you do and when you are doing that, you're the voice in the wilderness because you're speaking
Right.
against what they're learning in school, what they're seeing on TV, what they're getting through their phones. It's
Hmm.
just sort of like you against the beast, and the beast has a much larger megaphone. But that's why it's incumbent on us to sort of train up our children. So yeah, um, yeah,
Yep,
man. But I think
definitely.
that's productive.
Definitely. I think that kind of sums it up. That basically, like I said, just touching bases on the consequences of these type of societies when they don't um basically talk about and experience, or basically talk about and advertise things in an unhealthy way. And I think that hypersexualization fits in the category with many other things that are advertised in an unhealthy manner. So
Facts. And again, I'll close out Fayaz, closing out saying, historically, it's always been that's what I wanted to say. You made a point earlier when you said that you hadn't researched it in particular, but what I wanted to add to that was this. Sometimes you can have proofs that are of sort of a research value, tangible information, but sometimes you can apply the common sense acid test to something.
hmm.
So if there's a really strong, obvious correlation between two things, right, it's obvious that they have something to do with each other. And then,
Hmm.
that's a redundant way to put it. Whether or not you can definitively prove that one causes the other may or may not be necessary. If you can prove that they have a correlative effect, then you know to look out for the other when you see the one. So when you see hypersexualization in a society, right, there's a moral a decadence there. Now, you don't have to necessarily prove that hypersexualization led to moral decadence or moral decadence leads to hypersexualization, right? The presence of one means that you ought to be on the lookout for the other, sort of like where there's smoke, there's fire, right? Was there smoke first or was the fire there first? I mean, like, really, what difference does it make? If you see one or the other, it's going to mean sort of the same jeopardy. And so I forget specifically what you were saying, but you said that you were speaking on something. You said you hadn't exactly researched it, but I wanted to sort of just support what you were saying with that by
Yeah, I think I
saying,
was tying the link between the increase in aggression when I was talking about road rage and how it's
ah,
increasing.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's it. That's it. So, yeah, what I wanted to say is that sometimes it's enough to establish a correlative effect. So, if there's an increase in aggression and road rage, and then there's also an increase in sexual immorality and some other sort of behaviors, then what you can do is you can say, well, is it necessary to prove like which caused the other? And is it even necessary to sort of research to prove that when the correlative effect is so obvious, right? And you know that there are sources of aggression sort of behind that behavior that we see increasingly expressed in society. We see road rages, shootings, killings, all these things, abductions, and at the same time, we know what the porn industry is doing and what the even the regular industries are doing. You can't watch a movie nowadays without sort of at least getting a unhealthy dose of the illicitness. So, yeah, I just wanted to say that to that.
No, that was good. I'm glad you brought that up because I was kind of talking myself in a circle anyway. I was like, I know I ain't got the
Uh, so,
proof for it, but that
it's all
makes
good.
sense.
Yeah,
So yeah, so
sometimes the
that's
proof is evident.
yeah,
Yeah,
no, that's
yeah.
perfect.
Well, all right, bro.